It was the middle of the night when I heard them. Footsteps, impossibly close to my tent. But when I unzipped it and looked out, there was no one there. I decided to go on a solo camping trip, something I'd done a few times before. I needed to clear my head after a stressful few months at work, and the isolation of the woods always helped. The drive to the forest was long but peaceful, and by the time I set up my tent next to a quiet stream, I was feeling calm again. The first night I slept like a baby. The sound of the water flowing nearby was like a lullaby, and the gentle rustling of leaves from the wind created the perfect atmosphere. But on the second night, things took a turn. I woke up abruptly around 3 a.m. My eyes shot open, heart racing. At first, I didn't understand why I had woken up so suddenly. Everything was still. That's when I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. They were slow, almost as if someone was walking in circles around my tent, taking their time, savoring every step. I stayed completely still, listening. It was too dark outside to see anything, and I had no flashlight within arm's reach. My mind was racing. Could it be an animal? Maybe another camper? But who would walk so close to someone else's tent in the middle of the night? The footsteps stopped right outside the entrance of the tent. I could feel the presence of someone, or something, just inches away from where I lay. The air felt thick, and every instinct screamed at me to stay still. I eventually worked up the nerve to unzip the tent, just a crack, enough to peek outside. My heart pounded as I slowly scanned the area with my eyes. But there was no one. The forest was silent, eerily so. No rustling leaves, no animal sounds, just an unnatural stillness. I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe my mind playing tricks on me. The next day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the unease from the night before. I tried to enjoy the day, hiking through the woods and fishing in the creek, but there was a weight in the air, a sense of being watched. That night I was restless, unable to sleep. Then, like clockwork, the footsteps returned. But this time they were louder, faster, more aggressive. The sound circled my tent, growing closer with each pass. My heart raced as the sound stopped right outside the entrance, just like before. But this time I wasn't alone in my fear. I could feel it. A presence, something standing there just beyond the fabric of the tent, waiting. I scrambled for my flashlight, shining it out into the darkness. The beam cut through the trees, casting long, eerie shadows. But there was nothing there. No tracks, no movement. Just the cold, oppressive silence. The third night was when things escalated. I had decided to leave the next morning. I couldn't stand another sleepless night. But as soon as I lay down, I heard them again. This time, the footsteps didn't circle the tent. They approached directly, slow and heavy, as if whoever or whatever was coming straight for me. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent, and then the fabric of the tent started to press inward, as if something was pushing against it. My mind raced in sheer panic. I was trapped. I couldn't run, couldn't scream. All I could do was sit there, paralyzed, as the tent slowly caved in. I felt the pressure on my chest, as if something was hovering just above me, suffocating me with its presence. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The pressure lifted, the footsteps faded, and the tent returned to its normal shape. But I knew, whatever it wasn't gone. It was watching me, waiting. I packed up and left at first light, vowing never to camp in those woods again. Even now, years later, when I lie in bed, I sometimes hear those footsteps in the dead of night. And I know it's still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting for me to return. They told me it was just a local legend, a harmless ghost story. But when I saw him standing in the trees, I knew it was real. Our group of friends had been planning this camping trip for months. We chose a spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from any other campers or tourists. It was supposed to be a week of hiking, fishing, and enjoying the quiet of nature. The first few days were perfect. Clear skies, warm days, cool nights around the fire. But then, on the third day, we met a local at a gas station who changed everything. "You folks headed up the mountain?" he asked, a strange glint in his eye. We nodded, laughing it off as a typical question. But then he leaned in closer, his voice low. "You be careful up there. The man in the woods doesn't like strangers." At first, we thought he was joking, but his expression was deadly serious. He went on to tell us about an old legend, about a man who had lived in those woods decades ago, a recluse who had disappeared one winter and was never found. They say his spirit still wanders the woods, looking for lost hikers. We laughed it off as a spooky story, something to tell around the campfire later. But that night, things took a terrifying turn. It started with a sense of unease, a feeling that something was wrong. We were sitting around the campfire, talking and drinking, when I suddenly felt eyes on me. I looked up, scanning the darkness around us. Nothing. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I felt like we were being watched, and it wasn't just paranoia. Then one of my friends noticed it. A tall, shadowy figure standing between the trees, barely visible in the firelight. He was still, too still, like a statue. At first, we thought it was just our imaginations, maybe a trick of the light. But as we kept watching, the figure didn't move. He just stood there, silently observing us from the edge of the woods. We called out, thinking it might be another hiker, or maybe even someone lost. But there was no response. The figure didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, just watched. The next morning, we brushed it off as a prank. Maybe one of the locals trying to scare us. But that night, as we sat around the fire again, I felt it. The eyes. They were on us again. When I looked up, there he was, standing in the same spot, unmoving, watching us. We tried to ignore it, but the tension in the air was thick. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of the leaves made us jump. No one spoke. No one laughed. We were too afraid. By the third night, we were ready to leave. The figure had been appearing every night, always at the same distance, always watching. But this time it was worse. He was closer now, just a few feet from our campfire. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel his gaze, cold and piercing, as if he was studying us, waiting for something. When morning finally came, we packed up as fast as we could. As we hiked out, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, just beyond the tree line. And then, as we reached the trailhead, I turned around one last time. There he was, standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. But this time he raised his hand and waved. I still have nightmares about that figure, about those eyes. And every time I think about camping, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the next group of hikers to wander into his woods. You'd think hearing something breathing right behind you would make you feel someone's there. But when I turned around, nothing was there. My partner and I had been planning this camping trip for months. We were both nature lovers, and we had always talked about getting away from the city for a weekend. We chose a secluded spot in the forest, miles away from any other campers or towns. It was perfect. Just us, the trees, and the open sky. The first night was peaceful. We sat by the fire, roasted marshmallows, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The second night, however, was when things took a turn. I woke up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling, like I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe an animal passing by. But then I heard it, breathing. It was low, raspy, and close, too close. My heart started pounding in my chest. It sounded like someone was standing right next to me, just inches from my face. I slowly turned my head, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. The tent was empty, except for my partner, who was still fast asleep. The breathing stopped the moment I moved, leaving behind an eerie silence. I lay there for hours, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep. The next night, the same thing happened. This time, I was wide awake when I heard the breathing. It was even closer now, louder, as if someone was right next to my ear. I shot up, grabbing the flashlight and shining it around the tent. Nothing. No one. My partner woke up, groggy and confused, asking me what was wrong. I didn't know how to explain it. How do you tell someone that you can hear someone breathing in the tent, but there's no one there? I tried to laugh it off, saying it must have been a bad dream, but I knew it was real. The breathing was too clear, too distinct. The following night was the worst. I was on edge the entire day, dreading the moment when the sun would set and the darkness would take over the camp. We sat around the fire, but I couldn't relax. My eyes kept darting to the trees, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. When we finally went to bed, I lay there, staring up at the tent, waiting for the sound to return. And it did, louder than ever. The breathing was right next to me, almost as if someone was leaning over me, watching me sleep. I couldn't take it anymore. I shook my partner awake, telling them we needed to leave. We packed up our things in a hurry, not caring about the time or the fact that it was the middle of the night. As we drove away from the campsite, the feeling of being watched never left me. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing us. We never went back to that campsite, and even now, years later, when I'm alone in the dark, I sometimes hear that same raspy breathing. I don't know what it was, but whatever it wasn't human. We were lost. No GPS, no phone signal, and the strange thing was, we kept finding the same campfire over and over again, even though it wasn't ours. We had planned a week-long hiking trip in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. The area was known for its dense trees and foggy mornings, and we were excited to get away from the city. It was me, my two best friends, and my brother. We were all experienced hikers, so we didn't think much of it when we ventured off the main trail to find a more secluded spot to camp. The first 2 days were uneventful, and we were enjoying the peace and quiet. But on the third day, a thick fog rolled in, and we realized we had wandered too far off the trail. Our GPS wasn't working, and none of us had signal on our phones. Still, we weren't worried. We figured we'd find our way back eventually. But then we saw the campfire. We had been walking for hours trying to find our way back to the main trail when we stumbled upon a small clearing with a campfire burning in the center. At first, we were relieved, thinking we had found other campers who could help us. But there was no one there. The fire was burning, fresh wood stacked neatly beside it, but there were no tents, no signs of life. We called out, but no one answered. We decided to wait by the fire, thinking maybe the campers had gone for a walk and would be back soon. But as the hours passed, no one came. The fire never died down, and the wood beside it never seemed to run out. We tried to leave the clearing and find our way back, but no matter which direction we walked, we always ended up back at the same campfire. It was impossible. We marked trees, left items behind, but every path we took led us right back to that fire. The air felt heavy, oppressive, like the forest was closing in on us. And then the whispers started. Faint at first, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but they were there. Low, guttural voices speaking in a language we couldn't understand. By the time the sun set, we were terrified. We huddled by the fire, too scared to move. We could hear things moving in the trees, branches snapping, leaves rustling, as if something was circling us, waiting for the right moment to strike. None of us slept that night. We sat with our backs to the fire, watching the woods, praying for daylight. When the fog finally lifted the next morning, we wasted no time. We grabbed our things and ran, not caring which direction we went, as long as we got away from that fire. When we finally made it back to civilization, we asked the locals about the clearing. No one knew what we were talking about. There were no other campsites in that area. And when we went back to the spot on the map where we had found the fire, there was nothing there. No clearing, no fire pit, no signs that anyone had ever been there. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear those whispers. And I know deep down that the fire is still burning, waiting for the next group of lost campers to stumble upon it. The first time I saw them, I thought they were just fireflies. But fireflies don't have glowing red eyes, do they? It was the last night of our camping trip. We had spent the week exploring the forest, fishing, and enjoying the outdoors. Our campsite was near a lake, and the reflection of the stars on the water created a serene and peaceful atmosphere. It was the perfect ending to a perfect trip. But as the fire started to die down, I noticed something strange. Off in the distance, just beyond the tree line, I saw two small glowing red lights. At first, I thought they were fireflies, but they didn't move. They just hovered there, motionless, watching. I pointed them out to my friends, but they brushed it off, saying it was probably just an animal. But something about the way those lights stayed perfectly still unnerved me. They weren't blinking, weren't shifting. They were just staring. As the night wore on, the lights got closer. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they inched toward our camp. By the time we noticed, they were less than 50 feet away, hovering just outside the reach of the firelight. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal we weren't familiar with, or maybe our eyes were playing tricks on us. But deep down, we knew something wasn't right. The air grew colder, and the forest, which had been full of the sounds of crickets and night birds, fell completely silent. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the soft, steady whisper of the wind. But even that felt wrong, like the wind was trying to tell us something. And then, the eyes blinked. We froze, staring at the red lights as they disappeared for a moment, only to reappear closer than before. Whatever was out there, it was coming for us. We grabbed our flashlights and shined them into the trees, but the lights vanished. For a moment, we thought it was over, that whatever had been stalking us was gone. But then the whispers started. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind, but they were there. Low, guttural voices, like something ancient and malevolent was trying to communicate. The red eyes reappeared, closer this time, moving faster, darting in and out of the trees, as if they were circling us. We packed up our things as fast as we could, barely able to see in the darkness. The eyes followed us, staying just out of reach, watching, waiting. As we hiked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, some creature, emerging from the trees. But all I saw were those glowing red eyes. When we finally made it to the car, we didn't look back. We drove away as fast as we could, the fear still gripping us. But as I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw them, those glowing red eyes, watching us from the edge of the forest, growing smaller and smaller as we sped away. I still see them in my dreams sometimes. Those eyes, watching, waiting, as if they're just biding their time, waiting for the day I'll return to those woods.